Eleanor Whitmore lit the seventh candle herself. No servants, no husband, no apology note propped against the wine glass this time, because this time she hadn't even left one out for him. She sat straight-backed at the long dining table of Whitmore Hall, dressed in her finest blue silk, and she raised her glass to the empty chair across from her. Then she smiled. Not the practiced, patient smile she'd worn for 20 years of marriage. Something quieter. Something that belonged only to her. If you've ever celebrated alone and felt more free than broken, this story is for you. Subscribe. Stay until the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. The cake had 3 layers. Eleanor had asked Mrs. Holt to make it that way on purpose, not because she was celebrating anything grand, not because she expected company, but because she had spent 44 years of her life eating whatever portion she was given, and she had decided quietly and without announcement that she was done with that particular habit. 3 layers, Mrs. Holt. She had said that morning, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded at her waist. Lemon cream between each one, and none of that thin frosting you do for the supper parties. Real frosting. The kind that holds its shape. Mrs. Holt had looked at her with the careful, cautious expression of a woman who had worked in this household long enough to understand that something had shifted. "And shall I set the formal dining room ma'am candles on the long table?" "Yes," Eleanor had said. "All 12 of them." "All 12." Mrs. Holt repeated it slowly. That's a great deal of candle, Mrs. Whitmore. Are you expecting guests?" "No," Eleanor said, and her voice had been perfectly beautifully calm. "I'm expecting myself." That had been 8 hours ago. Now the candles burned low. The lemon cake sat on its silver stand with one clean slice already removed. Eleanor's slice eaten with deliberate, unhurried pleasure, and the clock above the parlor mantel read 9:30. Outside, the Virginia summer pressed thick and hot against the windows. Fireflies drifted across the dark lawn. Somewhere down the road a horse moved at a steady canter, and Eleanor listened to the hoofbeats without turning her head. She knew that rhythm. She had been listening to it for 20 years. Jonathan Whitmore rode the way he did everything with a certainty that assumed the world would arrange itself around his arrival. And for 20 years Eleanor had arranged herself accordingly. She had timed suppers to his return, held conversations at the pace he preferred, softened her opinions at dinner when the tobacco merchants came to call, worn the cream-colored dresses he favored over the blue ones she loved. She heard the front door open. She heard his boots on the marble entry hall. She heard him call to Thomas the houseboy, asking where his wife was. She did not move. She sat at the far end of the long dining table, 12 candles burning around her, one hand resting on the stem of her wine glass, and she waited. Jonathan Whitmore appeared in the doorway. He was still handsome, she thought distantly. That had never been the problem. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, with the kind of face that made strangers on the road trust him immediately. He wore his good riding coat, the charcoal one, which meant he had come from somewhere that required impressing people. His cravat was slightly loosened. He was carrying something wrapped in brown paper under his arm, and he was smiling the particular smile of a man who has just remembered something he forgot. He stopped when he saw the table. The 12 candles, the 3-layer cake, the single plate, the single wine glass, the single chair pulled neatly back at the far end. The smile flickered. "Eleanor." His voice came out careful, measured. You're still up." "I am," she said pleasantly. He took a step into the room, then another. His eyes moved from the cake to the candles to her face, and she watched him do the arithmetic. She watched the exact moment it landed. "It's your birthday," he said. "It is," she said. A long pause. The candle nearest to her guttered in a breath of night air from the open window. He cleared his throat. "Eleanor." The Ashford meeting ran on past sundown, and then Harrison's road washed out in the afternoon rain, and the detour added 2 hours at least. "Jonathan." Her voice was gentle, not cold, not sharp, just finished. "You don't need to explain the road. He came to a stop at the midpoint of the table 6 feet away from her, and he set the brown paper parcel down on the tablecloth between them. "I brought you something," he said. "I stopped in Charlottesville. The milliner there had these combs, the tortoiseshell ones you admired last spring. Remember?" You said. "I remember," she said. "I kept thinking about that." He pushed the parcel a little toward her. "I went back 3 times before they had the right pair." Eleanor looked at the parcel. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at her husband. "Jonathan," she said. "How many times?" He blinked. What? "How many times?" she said in the same pleasant, unhurried voice. "Have you forgotten my birthday?" The room went very quiet. One of the candles popped. Jonathan Whitmore stood at the center of the dining table, with his hand still resting on the brown paper parcel, and Eleanor watched his jaw tighten as he counted backward through years he had never bothered to mark. "This is the 7th, she said for him. "Eleanor, the first time," she said, "I was 37. You were in Richmond for the tobacco auction. I understood. I did. It was an important year. I told myself that." She lifted her wine glass and took a small, deliberate sip. "The second time you were in Baltimore. The third you were right here in this house. I found out later. You'd spent the afternoon at the Hargrove estate playing cards. You told me you'd had a meeting." She set the glass down, with the faintest click against the wood. "I didn't say anything then either." Jonathan's face had gone still. "I didn't know that you—" "Of course you didn't," she said simply. "Because I didn't tell you. Because I had spent so many years deciding that my telling you things would only trouble the peace of this house. I was good at peace, Jonathan. You always said so." A small smile. "You told your brother I was the most agreeable woman you'd ever married." "I meant it as a compliment," he said, and his voice had gone rough. "Eleanor, I know you did." She stood. She did it slowly, with perfect composure, smoothing the front of her blue silk dress, the blue one, not the cream one, and she picked up her wine glass and walked to the window. Outside, the fireflies moved in their slow, purposeless drift across the dark. "The combs are very beautiful," she said. "I'm sure they are. You have good taste, Jonathan. You always have. But I don't need the combs." "Then what do you need?" His voice came out louder than he intended. She heard him catch himself. Tell me what you need, Eleanor, and I need," she said carefully, "to stop needing things from you. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind that settles into the corners of a room and stays." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "What does that mean?" Eleanor turned from the window. She looked at her husband the way she had not looked at him in years, directly, without softening the edge of it, without calculating the safest angle from which to approach. "It means," she said, "that I've decided to take the cottage." "What cottage?" "Willow Creek." She moved back toward the table, set her wine glass down, and straightened the already straight silverware beside her plate. "Your grandfather's old property, the one that's been sitting empty since his passing. I spoke with Mr. Hale about the deed last month. It belongs to the Whitmore estate, which means technically it belongs to your management, but Mr. Hale agrees there is no legal reason I couldn't take it as a secondary residence. I will be moving there at the end of the week." Jonathan stared at her. "You spoke to Hale last month." "I did." "You've been planning this." "I've been thinking about it," she said with a precision that was its own kind of answer. "For quite some time." "Eleanor." He took a step toward her. Something in his face had shifted. The mild, distracted guilt had cracked open into something raw. "Eleanor, you can't simply, this is our home. You can't just leave and go live in a run-down old cottage because I forgot. You forgot 7 times, Jonathan." Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. That had always been one of the things people remarked on Eleanor Whitmore's composure, her steadiness, the way she never made scenes. But there was something in the quietness now that was different from what it had always been. It wasn't restraint. It wasn't patience. It was decision. "And I'm not leaving our home. I'm claiming one of my own." He reached out and put his hand on the back of a dining chair, gripping it. "This is about more than the birthday." "Yes," she said. "It is." Then tell me what it's about." She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat back down at her end of the table, folded her hands and looked at him. "Do you know what I did this afternoon, Jonathan, while you were on the road from Charlottesville?" She didn't wait for him to answer. "I finished an essay. I've been writing it since February, a piece on land inheritance laws as they apply to women in Virginia. I sent it to a printer in Richmond 2 weeks ago under the name E. Whitmore. He wrote back yesterday." She reached into the fold of her sleeve and produced a folded letter, set it on the table between them. "He wants to publish it." Jonathan didn't move. "He said it was one of the clearest arguments on the subject he'd read in 10 years of printing," she continued. "He asked if E. Whitmore had more work. I wrote back this morning and told him yes. I have 3 more pieces nearly finished." A long beat. Jonathan's hand was still on the back of the chair. "You've been writing essays," he said slowly. "I've been writing essays for 12 years, she said. "You knew I wrote. You've seen me at my desk." "I thought correspondence, letters, women's." He stopped himself. "Women's what?" The question was soft. He had the grace to look ashamed. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know it was that you were—" "You didn't ask," she said, not unkindly. "That is the whole of it, Jonathan. In 20 years you never asked." She folded the printer's letter back along its crease and tucked it into her sleeve. "I am going to Willow Creek on Friday. I will keep a proper household there. I'm taking Mrs. Holt with me, and Samuel Porter has agreed to see to the grounds. I am not divorcing you. I am not making any public declaration. I am simply—" She paused, searching for the word. "Separating my life from your schedule." Jonathan pulled the chair out and sat down heavily. He looked older suddenly, or perhaps just smaller, less certain of the particular shape the room was supposed to take. "And what am I supposed to do?" he said. "Come home to an empty house." "You have 15 rooms and 8 servants," she said. "You'll manage." "That isn't what I meant." "I know what you meant." She stood again, moved to the sideboard, and cut a second slice of the lemon cake. She set it on a clean plate and carried it to his end of the table, setting it down in front of him with a kind of courteous finality. "Eat something. You've had a long ride." He looked down at the cake. He looked up at her. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had dropped to something she hadn't heard from him in a very long time. Something uncertain and unhardened. "I don't want you to go." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said, "but I'm going." She blew out the nearest candle and walked to the door. "Eleanor," his voice followed her. Can I visit at the cottage?" She paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. "When you have something to say," she said, "that is worth making the ride for, yes." And then she walked out into the dark hallway, her heels quiet on the marble, leaving him alone with the cake and 11 burning candles, and the heavy particular silence of a man who had just understood for the first time the full shape of what he'd been taking for granted. The next morning, Eleanor rose before the sun. She did not ring for her maid. She dressed herself, something she had not done since before her marriage, since the years when she was still Eleanor Marsh, her father's middle daughter, the one who read too much and talked about it, and she went downstairs to the kitchen, where Mrs. Holt was already building the morning fire. Mrs. Holt looked up when she came in. She took one look at Eleanor's face and asked no questions. "I'll need packing trunks from the attic," Eleanor said, "and I'll want to speak with Samuel Porter before he starts on the East Garden." "I'll send Thomas up," Mrs. Holt said, and went back to her fire. Eleanor poured her own coffee. She carried it to the small table near the kitchen window. Not the formal breakfast room, not the dining room with last night's candles still standing cold in their holders, and she sat down and opened her writing case and uncapped her ink. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She was on the final section of her 3rd essay, a piece on the rights of married women to hold property in their own names, to conduct correspondence, to execute legal agreements. And she wrote with a kind of velocity she had not felt in months. Years, maybe. The words came the way they always did, when she was not watching herself, not calibrating her language for the comfort of her audience. They came blunt and clear and confident, the way her thoughts had always actually moved underneath all the years of careful softening. She was so absorbed that she did not hear Jonathan come in. She heard him stop. She finished her sentence before she looked up. He was standing at the kitchen doorway in his shirt and breeches without his coat, which meant he had come down early too, or perhaps had not slept, she thought, looking at the shadows under his eyes. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and an expression on his face she could not immediately name. "You're working," he said. "I am," she said. He stood there a moment. Then he came into the kitchen, past the big work table, past the hanging copper pots, and he sat down across from her, without asking permission to join her, which she supposed was still his habit, and she supposed she did not entirely mind yet. He looked at the pages spread in front of her, covered in her small, dense handwriting. He looked at the ink stain on her index finger. "How long have you been up?" he said. "Since 5. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I didn't sleep," he said. She waited. "I kept thinking about what you said, about 12 years. He looked up at her. "Is that true? Have you been writing this kind of work for 12 years? 11.5, she said. "The first year I only managed a few pages before I convinced myself it was foolish. By the second year, I had a full draft." "And you never told me." She held his gaze. "I told you once, in the second year. You said it sounded interesting, and asked if the pork at dinner was from our smokehouse or Harrison's." She said it without bitterness, as a fact. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. "I don't remember that." "I know," she said. "That is rather the point, Jonathan." He was quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the first real light of morning was pushing up behind the tree line, gold and hazy, the way Virginia summer mornings always came, like something tentative trying its luck. Eleanor looked at it for a moment and felt the same thing she'd felt last night blowing out that candle. Not anger, not grief. Something much quieter and much more permanent. "I'll have Thomas bring the trunks down this morning," she said, and capped her ink. "Eleanor." He reached across the table and put his hand on her writing case, not on her hand, not reaching for her, just a gesture, a stop sign. "I need you to know that I understand this is my doing." She looked at his hand on her case, then at his face. "I'm not asking you to change your plans," he said. "I'm not going to argue about the cottage. I just need you to know that I understand it." He took a breath. All of it. Not just the birthday. She studied him. In 20 years, she had learned to read the difference between Jonathan Whitmore contrite and Jonathan Whitmore strategic, and what she saw on his face now was neither. It was something more uncomfortable than either. It was a man sitting very still in the ruins of an assumption he had held so long, he had forgotten it was an assumption. "All right," she said. "All right. I hear you," she said. "That is all I'm saying. I hear you." She picked up her writing case, gathered her pages, and stood. "I'll have breakfast on the table at 8 if you want to join me in the dining room. There are things I want to discuss about the cottage, practical things about the well and the repair to the east wall." "I'll be there," he said immediately. She walked to the kitchen door. She paused. "Jonathan," she said without turning around. "Yes, the combs are very beautiful," she said. "I put them on my dressing table." She heard him exhale. She walked out into the hallway and up the stairs, and she did not smile until she was certain she was alone, and then briefly in the quiet of the upper landing, with the morning coming through the tall window at the end of the hall, she did. Not triumphantly, not with vindication, just with the strange, clean feeling of a woman who has finally, after a very long time, said the thing she meant. Chippewa. By Thursday evening, the packing was nearly done. Eleanor stood in the middle of her study, the small room off the library that Jonathan had always called her sitting room, as though the idea of a woman having a room for work required a softer name. And she looked at the shelves of books she was taking, and the shelves she was leaving, and she made her decisions without sentimentality. Her sister Abigail arrived on Thursday afternoon without warning, which was Abigail's particular style of arrival. She was 3 years younger than Eleanor and approximately twice as loud, with the kind of presence that made rooms feel immediately smaller and conversations feel immediately more alive. She walked into the study, took one look at the trunks and said, "Good Lord, you're actually doing it." "Hello, Abigail," Eleanor said. "Don't hello Abigail me." Abigail came in, stepped over a stack of books, and put her hands on her hips. "I've been writing you letters for 3 years telling you that man takes you for granted like a good road, and now you're moving into grandfather's cottage and you couldn't even—" "I wrote you Tuesday," Eleanor said. "Tuesday, I'm in Fredericksburg. That letter won't reach me until—" Abigail stopped, looked at the expression on Eleanor's face, and shifted tactics. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Truly. Abigail." Eleanor turned from the shelf and looked at her sister directly. "I am the most all right I have been in quite some years. Can you help me decide which of these I need at the cottage and which can stay?" Abigail looked at her for a long moment. Whatever she saw in her sister's face seemed to satisfy something, because she let out a breath, pulled off her traveling gloves, and rolled up her sleeves. "Hand me the Wollstonecraft," she said. "That one's coming with you." "Obviously," Eleanor said. They worked side by side for 2 hours, talking the way they had not talked since before Eleanor's marriage, quickly, honestly, with the full weight of their actual opinions, which was the only way Eleanor had ever been able to speak with her sister. Abigail asked about Jonathan. Eleanor told her what she had told him. Abigail was quiet for a moment after that, which was unusual enough that Eleanor looked over. "He sat with you," Abigail said. "At breakfast." "He did. And he didn't argue about the cottage." "He argued a little," Eleanor said. Then he stopped. Abigail considered this. "Huh," she said. "Huh." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Nothing." Abigail stacked 3 volumes of legal theory on top of each other. I've spent 3 years thinking of your husband as the kind of man who is immune to the information that he has been unkind. And perhaps I was wrong about that. You may have been," Eleanor allowed. "Or he may simply be surprised enough to be quiet for a while. I don't know which yet." "Which do you want it to be?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She picked up a small leather-bound journal, her first one from the year she started writing seriously, and she turned it in her hands. "I want," she said slowly, "for Willow Creek to be mine first. Whatever Jonathan becomes or doesn't become, that is a separate matter. The cottage is not about him." "No," Abigail said. "It isn't, is it?" It wasn't a question. Eleanor put the journal in the trunk with the other books. "Now," she said, "tell me about Fredericksburg. Your last letter said something about a school teacher." Abigail brightened immediately. "Oh, Clara Bennett, you must meet her, Eleanor. She runs a village school out of her own house, charges nothing for the girls, half rates for the boys, and she has opinions on the Virginia education system that would make half the legislature sit down very fast. She's moving to the county this summer, as a matter of fact." A beat. "She's taking a position in Ashford. That's not far from Willow Creek." Eleanor looked up. Abigail smiled with very deliberate innocence. "I may have mentioned in my last letter to her that my sister was moving to the area. I may have mentioned that my sister is rather remarkable. And I may have completely by coincidence enclosed your essay on land inheritance." Abigail. "She wrote back within the week," Abigail said. She said, and I'm quoting here, that E. Whitmore was writing the things that needed to be said by someone with the nerve to say them plainly. Eleanor stood very still for a moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the trunk. "She said that." "She did." Abigail sat down beside her. "Eleanor, you have been writing in this house for 12 years and letting no one know about it except a printer in Richmond who has no idea you are a woman. You are moving to a cottage 12 miles from this house and starting over on your own terms." She put her arm around her sister's shoulders. "I think it is time you stopped writing in secret." Outside the study window, the summer evening was settling in warm and full and unhurried, the way Virginia evenings do, like they have nowhere in particular to be and are perfectly content about it. Eleanor looked at the stack of trunks. She looked at the half-empty shelves. She looked at the journal tucked into the open trunk with its cracked leather cover and the 12 years of careful secret work it represented. "Yes," she said finally. "I think it is." Willow Creek Cottage smelled like cedar and old rain, and something underneath both of those things that Eleanor could not name, but recognized immediately as hers. She stood in the front room on Friday morning with her traveling coat still buttoned, her hat still on her head, and she breathed it in. Mrs. Holt was behind her, directing Thomas with the trunks. Samuel Porter was already somewhere out back, his voice carrying through the walls as he talked to himself about the state of the garden, the way old men talk to themselves about things they intend to fix. The sounds of other people moving through space that belonged to her. Eleanor took off her hat. She set it on the windowsill, not on a hook, not on a stand, just on the sill, where the morning light hit it, and she stood there another moment before she said, "Mrs. Holt, where would you like the kitchen things?" "Already sorted, ma'am," Mrs. Holt called back. "You go write something." Eleanor almost laughed. She went to write something. The cottage had a back room she had decided would be her study. A small east-facing room with a single window and a stone floor and walls that held the cool of the night well into the afternoon. She had sent a writing desk ahead of her on Wednesday, along with her ink and her paper, and 2 of the oil lamps from her study at Whitmore Hall. When she walked into the room, everything was exactly where she had arranged for it to be. She sat down. She uncapped her ink. She wrote the first line of the day. The right of a woman to hold property in her own name is not a matter of sentiment but of law, and she felt something in her chest unknot that she had not known was tied. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. On Saturday, the neighbor came. Eleanor heard the knock at the front door and heard Mrs. Holt's voice, and then an unfamiliar woman's voice, and she capped her ink and went to the front room to find a woman approximately her own age standing in the doorway with a jar of preserves in one hand and a completely unabashed expression of curiosity on her face. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said. "I'm Clara Bennett. Your sister wrote to me about you. I hope you don't mind. I was passing on my way from Ashford, and I thought I'd stop and introduce myself rather than wait to be introduced." Eleanor looked at her. Clara Bennett was compact and direct, with the kind of eyes that took accurate measure of a room and its occupants without appearing to do so. She was simply dressed traveling clothes, sensible boots, and she held the preserves jar with the ease of someone who was accustomed to arriving at places without apology. "Miss Bennett," Eleanor said. "Please come in." "I won't stay long," Clara said, coming in. "I know you've just arrived. I only wanted to say—" She paused, and something in her direct expression shifted slightly, became more careful. "I read your essay on inheritance law, the one your sister sent me." Eleanor felt something tighten at the back of her throat. And I want to know." Clara Bennett said why you published it under initials. The directness of it was so unexpected that Eleanor stood still for a full second before she answered. "Because printers in Richmond are more likely to consider an argument on its merits if they don't know the person making it is a woman." "That's practical," Clara said. "It's also a shame." She set the preserves jar on the side table. "I've been writing a proposal for the county school board for 2 years. They've tabled it twice. Both times the men who tabled it used language I can only describe as polite condescension." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "I think if I'd had your essay in my hand at those meetings, the conversation might have gone differently." Eleanor studied her. "You think legal argument would have moved a school board?" "I think the specific legal argument you made about women's right to enter contractual agreements without a husband's signature would have moved at least 2 of them," Clara said precisely. "One of them is trying to get his daughter into a teaching position. The law as it currently stands makes that complicated. Your essay makes it less complicated." A small, brisk pause. "So I came to ask if you had more." Eleanor looked at this woman who had walked into her cottage 12 miles from her old life and asked the question no one in her actual life had ever thought to ask. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I have 3 more nearly finished." Clara Bennett smiled for the first time. It changed her face entirely. "Good," she said. Would you like some coffee while you tell me about them? The first week at Willow Creek set a rhythm that Eleanor had not known she was capable of. She rose at 5. She wrote until 8. She had breakfast, real breakfast, the kind with enough on the plate, and then she walked. Not the measured, purposeful walks of a woman with a household to return to, but the long, wandering kind that took her down to the creek and back through the East Meadow, and sometimes as far as the old Miller Road and back. She walked the way she had not walked since she was a girl in her father's house when she had been allowed to be impractical about it. Clara Bennett came by on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and they sat in Eleanor's study or at the kitchen table and talked about law and education and the very particular difficulties of being a woman with opinions in a county that preferred its women decorative. Clara brought problems. Eleanor brought arguments. Between the two of them, something began to accumulate that felt like a plan, though neither of them said so yet. On the Tuesday of the second week, Clara arrived with a different expression than usual, something behind the directness that Eleanor had learned to read as suppressed frustration. She sat down at the kitchen table and said without preamble, "The board tabled my proposal again." "On what grounds?" Eleanor said. "On the grounds," Clara said, clipping each word, "that they were not convinced there was adequate demand among village families for expanded girls' schooling. Despite the fact that I submitted a list of 32 families who had expressed direct interest." She set her hands flat on the table. "They said they would reconsider in the spring. That's 9 months. 9 months of girls not being educated while the boys go on," Eleanor said. 9 months, Clara confirmed. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if we don't wait for the board?" Clara looked up. Meaning I have a cottage with a front room I am not presently using for anything between the hours of 9 and noon. Eleanor kept her voice level. "And you have 32 families who want their daughters educated. The board can reconsider in the spring. We'll simply have been teaching for 9 months by the time they do." Clara stared at her. "Is there a law against it?" Eleanor said. "There's no law that—" Clara stopped. Started again. "You're serious?" "I was trained to always consider whether there was a legal barrier before assuming there was a practical one," Eleanor said. "Is there a law against 2 women teaching children in a private home?" A long pause. Clara said slowly, "No, there is not." "Then," Eleanor said, "we start Monday." They started Monday. By the end of the first week, 11 girls between the ages of 8 and 15 were sitting on chairs brought in from 3 different rooms of Willow Creek Cottage. And Clara Bennett was standing at the front of Eleanor's parlor with a piece of chalk and the kind of authority that made the room naturally quiet. Eleanor sat at the back and listened, and occasionally added something when Clara nodded at her, and it was the most useful she had felt in a very long time. At the end of the second week, one of the mothers, a woman named Ruth Carey, whose daughter was the sharpest of the 11, stopped Eleanor on the path outside and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to say something." "Of course," Eleanor said. "My Martha," Ruth said. She was a practical woman, lean and sun-weathered, the kind of woman who chose her words the way she chose her tools for what they could actually do. She came home last Tuesday, and she told her father what she'd learned that day, about the property laws, about what a woman can and can't sign for herself. Ruth paused. "My husband sat at the dinner table for a full minute without saying anything. Then he said, 'I didn't know that,' and Martha said, 'I didn't either until today.'" Ruth looked at Eleanor steadily. "I want to say thank you for what you're teaching them, not just letters." Eleanor felt something move in her chest that was too large for the moment and too necessary to dismiss. "Tell Martha," she said carefully, "that knowing the law is only half of it. The other half is deciding what to do with what you know." Ruth Carey nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I reckon that's true for more than just the girls." She walked on down the path, and Eleanor stood in the warm afternoon and thought about that for a long time. Cheers. It was on a Wednesday, the 4th week, the day the printer's letter arrived from Richmond, that Jonathan came. Eleanor heard the horse first, the way she always did, and this time she felt something complicated move through her that was neither the old dutiful readiness nor simple resistance. She was in the garden with Samuel Porter discussing the state of the well casing, and she looked up at the sound on the road and waited. Jonathan rode up to the gate and stopped. He did not immediately dismount, which told her he was uncertain of his welcome. She watched him make the decision to get down. He tied his horse at the gatepost. He walked up the path. He was wearing plain clothes, not his formal coat, not his riding best, and he had no package under his arm this time, which she noticed and filed carefully. "Eleanor," he said, stopping a few feet away. He glanced at Samuel, who was deeply occupied with studying the well casing and absolutely not listening. "I hope I'm not—" "You rode 12 miles, she said. "You might as well come in." She led him inside and left him standing in the front room while she washed her hands at the basin. When she came out, he was looking at the chairs Clara had arranged for the school, 11 of them, in rough rows, chalk still on the slate board, propped against the wall. He turned when she came in. "You're running a school," he said. "Miss Bennett is running a school," Eleanor said. "I am providing the room." He looked at the chairs. He looked at the board. "How many students?" 11, all girls. "We expect 3 more next week." A long pause. Jonathan turned to face her fully. "I came," he said, "because I received a letter." Eleanor waited. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Not the printer's letter she registered. This was different paper, heavier. He held it out to her. She took it and looked at the seal. It was from a man named Thomas Aldridge, an attorney in Charlottesville she did not know. She looked up at Jonathan. "Read it," he said, and his voice was careful in a way that told her nothing about what she would find. She opened it. She read it, and then she read it again. Thomas Aldridge, attorney, wrote on behalf of his client, one Mr. William Hale, the same. Mr. Hale she had spoken to about the cottage deed to inform Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore that Mr. Hale had, upon further review of the Whitmore family property records, identified an inconsistency in the original deed of Willow Creek Cottage. The inconsistency, Mr. Aldridge wrote in the careful language of a man who knew the letter would be unwelcome, suggested that the property had not in fact passed to the general Whitmore estate as previously believed, but had been left specifically and by name to the first Mrs. Jonathan Whitmore in a codicil attached to the elder Whitmore's will, which meant it was specifically and by name Eleanor's. No management required. No legal uncertainty. No husband's signature. Hers. Eleanor lowered the letter. She looked at Jonathan. His face was doing something she could not quite read, a mixture of things that moved across it too quickly like weather on an open road. "I went to see Hale on Monday," he said. "I told him I wanted to make certain the cottage transfer was properly documented. He showed me the codicil." A beat. "It was filed in 1807. My grandfather added it 6 months before he died. He wrote your name in it." "He wrote my name," Eleanor repeated very carefully. "He liked you," Jonathan said, and his voice came out rough. "He told me once, the Christmas before he died, he said, 'Eleanor is the sharpest person you've brought into this family, Jonathan, and you'd do well not to take that lightly.'" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I didn't remember that until Hale read me the codicil." Eleanor stood in the quiet of the room with the letter in her hands, and the 11 schoolroom chairs in their rows, and the chalk on the slate, and the sound of the summer outside pressing warm and patient against the walls of a cottage that had been, it turned out, always hers. "Jonathan," she said. "Yes." "I think," she said carefully, "that you should sit down." He sat. She went and put the kettle on herself because Mrs. Holt had gone to the market, and she needed a moment with her hands doing something ordinary. She came back and set 2 cups on the table between them, and she sat down across from him, and she did not speak immediately, and he had the sense to wait. "Tell me something," she said finally. "Anything," he said, and she believed he meant it, which was itself something new. "Did you know about the codicil when we married?" He held her gaze. "No, I swear to you, Eleanor, I had no idea." But you knew he liked me. Yes. And you still... She stopped. Chose the word carefully. You still treated this marriage as though I were a household convenience. It landed hard. She saw it land. Jonathan did not look away, which was, she thought, perhaps the first genuinely brave thing she had seen him do in a very long time. Yes, he said. I did. And I don't have a good explanation for it that doesn't make me sound like exactly the kind of man I don't want to be. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I think, Eleanor, I think I have been very comfortable for a very long time, and comfort is an easy thing to confuse with contentment. I was content. I assumed you were too. You assumed without asking. I assumed without asking, he said. Another silence. A different kind than the ones they'd had at Whitmore Hall, less weighted somehow, more honest. I want to ask now, Jonathan said, if you'll let me. Eleanor looked at her husband across the kitchen table of a cottage that had been left to her by a man who had seen her clearly when the man she married had not. She thought about 12 years of essays in secret. She thought about Ruth Carey's daughter, Martha, learning property law on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about Clara Bennett's eyes when Eleanor had said, "We start Monday." She thought about what it felt like to blow out that seventh candle and feel for the first time like the action was hers. Ask, she said. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, gathering himself. Then slowly, carefully, as if he understood that the words actually mattered now. What are you working on? The new essay. What is it about? Eleanor looked at him. She set her cup down, and she told him. She told him about the essay on married women's contract rights, and about the 2 pieces she had in draft on education access, and about the letter from the Richmond printer, and about Clara Bennett and the school board, and the 11 girls in the front room chairs, and what Ruth Carey had said on the path about Martha telling her father what she'd learned, and the father sitting quiet at the dinner table for a full minute. She told him all of it, not the summarized version she would have given him 2 months ago, calculated to take up the minimum amount of his attention, but the actual version with all its pieces, the way she would have told Abigail. Jonathan Whitmore listened. He did not look at the window. He did not look at the door. He did not reach for his coffee and use the drinking of it as a pause. He sat still and he listened, and when she stopped talking, he was quiet for a moment that felt like genuine thought, rather than the gathering of a polite response. The school board, he said. They tabled it twice. Twice? Eleanor confirmed. On the grounds of insufficient demand. He said it flatly. Despite a list of 32 families. Despite the list. Jonathan's jaw tightened in a way she recognized not at her, but at something that deserved it. I know 2 of those board members, he said. Harrison Alcott and Edmund Graves. I've sat at dinner with both of them. A pause. Alcott's wife taught school before they married. He never mentions it. No, Eleanor said. Men like Alcott rarely do. Jonathan looked at her. Would it help if I wrote to them? Eleanor felt a sharp, complicated thing move through her chest. She sat with it for a moment before she answered. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I need to think about whether the school wants that kind of help before it's asked for. This is Clara's work. It's not my decision alone. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Then I'll wait until you know. She looked at him. You'll wait. I'll wait, he said. And something in the way he said it, not the flat compliance of a man who had learned to say the right word, but the quieter sound of a man learning to mean it, made Eleanor, for the first time in a very long time, consider the possibility that her husband was capable of being someone she had not yet met. She didn't say that, not yet. It was too new, and she had learned too well the cost of spending hope in advance. But she did refill his coffee, and she let him sit at the table for another hour while she went back to her writing. The letter from Abigail arrived the following morning, and it was the kind of letter Abigail wrote when she had been thinking hard about something, and couldn't stop 4 pages dense and rapid, her handwriting running downhill when she got excited. Eleanor. It began. Clara Bennett wrote to me. She told me about the school and about you offering the cottage, and I want to say that I have never been less surprised by anything in my life, And also, I have been telling people for years that you were remarkable, and no one believed me, which is their loss, and currently my considerable satisfaction." Eleanor smiled at that and kept reading. "But I am writing because I heard something in Fredericksburg last week that I think you need to know. James Whitmore. Jonathan's brother has been telling people in Richmond that you have left the marriage, not separated. Left. He is telling people you have gone to live alone in a derelict cottage, and that Jonathan is, and I am quoting Charlotte Everly, who was at the dinner, managing the situation with great patience. As though you are the situation." Eleanor stopped reading. She read that paragraph again. Then she set the letter down on her writing desk and sat very still for a moment, and she thought about James Whitmore, who she had never liked and who had never pretended to like her, and who had spent 20 years treating her the way men like James Whitmore treat women who are smarter than them, with a particular specific kind of dismissal that masquerades as charm. She thought about the word derelict. She thought about the word situation. And then she thought about Clara Bennett and 11 chairs and a printer in Richmond and a codicil signed in 1807 with her name on it. She picked up the letter and kept reading. "I think Abigail wrote 3 pages later, 'You need to decide what this looks like publicly. Not for Jonathan's sake, for yours. Because right now, James Whitmore is writing the story, and Eleanor, you have always been the better writer.'" Eleanor folded the letter. She put it in the top drawer of her desk. She picked up her pen. She did not write to Jonathan. She did not write to James. She wrote to the printer in Richmond, a full letter, 2 pages, explaining that E. Whitmore was prepared to submit the next essay, and had in addition a proposal for a regular column on the subject of women's legal standing in the state of Virginia. She signed it with her full name, Eleanor Marsh Whitmore. She sealed the letter before she could revise that decision. She called Thomas in from the garden and sent it with the afternoon post. Then she went back to writing, and she did not stop until Mrs. Holt knocked on the study door at 6 o'clock to say that supper was ready, and also that there was a horse tied at the gatepost again. Eleanor looked up from her pages. She felt the same complicated thing she had felt last Wednesday, and then underneath it, something new. Something that had not been there before. She capped her ink. She straightened her pages. She went to see what her husband had to say for himself this time, and she went without bracing herself for disappointment, which was, she thought, not nothing at all. Jonathan was standing in her front room with his hat in his hands and an expression she had never seen on him before. Not guilt, not charm, not the careful neutrality of a man managing a domestic situation. Something rawer than any of those. Something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "James came to see me," he said. Eleanor closed the front door behind her and stood still when, this afternoon, he rode out to Whitmore Hall. Jonathan set his hat on the side table, the same sill where she'd set hers that first Friday morning. "He sat in my library for 2 hours, Eleanor, and he told me that what you're doing out here is an embarrassment to the family name, that the school is inappropriate, that the essays—" He stopped. "He knows about the essays," Eleanor said. Not a question. "He knows about the printer in Richmond. He knows you signed the last letter with your full name." Jonathan looked at her directly. "He said he has friends at the paper, and that if you publish under your real name, people will talk. He said it reflects on me. He said—" Jonathan exhaled hard through his nose. "He said a great many things. Eleanor and I sat there, and I listened to all of them, and then I told him to get out of my house." The room went very quiet. "You told him to leave," Eleanor said carefully. "I told him," Jonathan said, and his voice was not loud, but it was steady in the way of a man who had made a decision and intended to keep it, "that my wife is a legal scholar and an educator, and that if the Richmond paper publishes her work, I will be purchasing 50 copies and sending them to every man I know." He paused. "And then I rode out here to tell you that because I thought you should know before you heard it from James or anyone else." Eleanor looked at her husband. She thought about all the dinners she had sat through while James Whitmore made his small, precise cuts at her opinions, her reading her silence, and Jonathan had said nothing. Not out of cruelty. Out of the easy inattention of a man who did not think anything important was happening. "Jonathan," she said. "Yes." "Did you mean it about the 50 copies?" He looked at her with something that was almost like the beginning of a smile. "I'll need your help with the mailing list," he said. "I don't know all the right people." So, it was Abigail who brought the news from Fredericksburg 3 days later, and she brought it in person, which meant it was serious. She arrived before breakfast, her horse lathered and her face set in the expression Eleanor privately called Abigail's battle posture. Jaw forward, eyes absolutely steady, the look of a woman who has decided to be angry on someone else's behalf and intends to do it thoroughly. She walked in, sat down at the kitchen table, and said Charlotte Everly hosted a tea yesterday. Eleanor poured her coffee. And James Whitmore was there. Abigail wrapped both hands around the cup. "Men don't attend Charlotte Everly's teas, Eleanor. He made a point of attending this one. He told 3 women, including Helen Alcott, whose husband is on the school board, that you are conducting an illegal school on Whitmore property without your husband's knowledge or consent. He said Jonathan is considering requiring you to close it." Eleanor set the coffee pot down. "He said it is a liability." Abigail continued, clipping each word clean. "He said there are questions about the property deed. He said, and this is the part I want you to really hear, he said that E. Whitmore the essayist is a fiction, that the name on those essays does not belong to any real woman of standing in this county." The kitchen was very still. "He's trying to erase me," Eleanor said. The words came out quiet and precise without drama, which somehow made them worse. "He's trying to erase you," Abigail confirmed, "before you get big enough to be harder to erase." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who else was at the tea?" "Ruth Carey was there." Abigail's voice shifted slightly. "Apparently she attended as Charlotte Everly's seamstress. She does alterations for the Everly household. She heard everything James said. She came directly to my lodgings at the Fredericksburg Inn and told me every word." Eleanor thought about Ruth Carey, about Martha, about "I didn't know that" at the dinner table, about the particular clarifying power of a woman who has no reason to pretend. "Where is Ruth now?" Eleanor asked. "On her way here," Abigail said. "She's bringing Martha." Bag. Ruth Carey arrived before noon. Martha beside her, both of them travel-dusty and direct. Martha was 13, dark-eyed with her mother's precision, and something extra in the set of her chin that Eleanor recognized because she had spent 44 years carefully not showing it in public. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ruth said before she was fully through the door. "I need to tell you what I heard exactly, and I need you to decide what to do with it, because I am a seamstress and not a lawyer, and I think what Mr. James Whitmore said yesterday requires a lawyer." "Tell me," Eleanor said. Ruth told her. Every word with the accuracy of a woman who had trained herself to remember things precisely because she had learned early that her word would be questioned. James Whitmore had said in the hearing of 7 women at Charlotte Everly's tea that the Willow Creek property deed was under review, that the codicil Eleanor had cited was of uncertain legal standing, that the school operating on the property was therefore unauthorized, that Jonathan Whitmore was in the process of consulting attorneys. "He's lying," Eleanor said the moment Ruth finished. "The codicil has already been confirmed by Mr. Hale, and Jonathan is not consulting anyone about closing the school." "I know he's lying," Ruth said. "That's why I'm here." Martha, who had been standing quietly beside her mother, said, "Mrs. Whitmore, what's a codicil?" "In addition to a will," Eleanor said. "A legal document that grants property or rights to a specific person." Martha thought about that. "So the cottage is yours." "The cottage is mine," Eleanor said. "Then he can't do anything," Martha said with the absolute uncluttered logic of 13 years old. "He can't do anything legally," Eleanor said, "but he can do quite a lot socially. He can make people uncertain. He can make the school board nervous. He can make Clara Bennett's work harder." She looked at Ruth. "He can make the Richmond printer hesitate." Ruth held her gaze. "So what do you do?" Eleanor straightened. She thought about the sealed letter she had sent to Richmond with her full name on it. She thought about Jonathan in her front room with his hat in his hands. She thought about Abigail's letter, "You have always been the better writer." "I stopped letting him write the story," she said. She wrote to Jonathan first. Not a long letter. 3 sentences. James has been spreading misinformation about the property deed and the school at Charlotte Everly's tea. I need the original codicil document from Mr. Hale. I need it by tomorrow. She sent Thomas with it on the fast horse. Then she sat down and wrote the 4th essay. She had been planning it as a piece on education rights, measured and legal and careful. She wrote that version for 40 minutes. Then she stopped. She read back what she had written. She uncapped her ink again, and she started over. The new version began. There is a particular kind of man who, upon hearing that a woman has done something significant, dedicates himself not to understanding it, but to ensuring that no one else does either. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping. Clara Bennett arrived at 3 o'clock, walked into the study, read the first 2 pages over Eleanor's shoulder, and said, "Publish that." "I intend to," Eleanor said, and kept writing. The codicil arrived the next morning, delivered by Thomas, and accompanied by a letter from Jonathan. That was the longest thing he had written to her in 20 years of marriage. She read the letter first. "Eleanor, I spoke with Hale this morning, and he confirmed everything you said. He is prepared to provide a sworn attestation of the codicil's validity should it be questioned. I also spoke with Harrison Alcott. I know you said to wait, and I apologize for not waiting. But James has been at Alcott directly as well, and I thought it was worth the conversation before he got further." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She kept reading. "I want to tell you what Alcott said, because I think you should hear it. He said he had not been aware that the school existed. He said, Eleanor, he said that if the instruction being offered is of the quality that Miss Bennett is known for, he saw no reason the board should have any objection. He asked me to convey his personal interest in seeing the proposal reconsidered at the next meeting. I know I moved ahead of your permission. I am telling you what I did so you can decide what to do with it. This is your work and your school, and I am aware of that. But I was not willing to sit at Whitmore Hall while my brother dismantled everything you've built here, and I hope you can accept that even if the method was imperfect. The codicil is enclosed, J." Eleanor folded the letter. She held it in both hands for a moment. She thought about imperfect methods and the difference between a man who moves ahead of permission because he thinks he knows better and a man who moves ahead of permission because he cannot stand to watch something he values be destroyed. She was not entirely certain yet which one Jonathan was in this instance. But the letter, the honesty of it, the acknowledgement without excuse was not nothing. She put it in the drawer with Abigail's letter. Then she went to find Clara. Clara Bennett's reaction to the news about Alcott was not what Eleanor expected. She went quiet for a long moment, the particular quiet of someone running through consequences. And then she said, "If Alcott is reconsidering, James Whitmore will know about it by the end of the week." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and if he knows Alcott is softening, he'll push harder somewhere else." Clara looked at her. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something I haven't told you yet." Eleanor waited. "When I applied for the position in Ashford," Clara said, "there was another candidate. A man. He had less experience and fewer endorsements, and I was offered the position anyway, which I considered briefly a sign of progress." She paused. "Last week I found out that James Whitmore is on the Ashford Church vestry, and that the vestry provides a significant portion of the school's annual operating funds." The silence that followed had a particular texture to it. "He can move against you through the school," Eleanor said. "He can apply pressure," Clara said carefully. "He has not done so yet. But if our school here becomes a direct challenge to the board, and if your essays keep publishing, and if Jonathan is openly supporting you, James Whitmore will need to respond somehow." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "I am not saying stop. I am saying know what you're walking into." Eleanor looked at this woman, this sharp, careful, entirely committed woman who had been navigating these exact pressures alone for years before Eleanor arrived with her cottage and her ink and her long overdue anger. Clara, she said, did you take the Ashford position knowing about the vestry connection? Clara was quiet for a beat. I found out after, she said. But I would have taken it anyway. A small, precise pause. I have been navigating men like James Whitmore my entire working life. They always have some connection to the money. The question is whether the work is worth the navigation. Is it? Eleanor said. Clara looked at her as though the question were slightly beside the point. 11 girls, she said. 14 by Monday. Ruth Carey's Martha learned the definition of a codicil last week and came home and explained property law to her father over supper. She let that sit for a moment. Yes, she said, it is. James Whitmore came to Willow Creek on a Thursday. Eleanor knew it was him before she opened the door. The horse at the gate was too good, too deliberate, the kind of animal chosen to make an impression. She was in the middle of reading a letter from the Richmond printer, who had responded to her full name submission with an enthusiasm that had made Mrs. Holt, who had handed her the letter, give a small, satisfied nod. Eleanor set the printer's letter face down on her desk and went to the door. James Whitmore was 6 years younger than Jonathan, and had always moved through rooms as though they owed him the best chair. He was handsome in the angular way of the Whitmore men, and he used it consciously. He smiled when she opened the door. Eleanor, he said warmly, I hope I'm not intruding. You are intruding, she said pleasantly. Come in. He came in. He looked around the front room, at the schoolroom chairs, at the slate board, at the neat, purposeful organization of a room that had clearly been claimed by someone who knew exactly what she was doing with it. His smile did not change, but something behind it recalibrated. I wanted to speak with you directly, he said. I feel we've let misunderstanding accumulate between us, and that's never good for family. Sit down, James, Eleanor said. He sat. She remained standing, which was a small thing, but not nothing. I've heard some of what you've been saying in Fredericksburg, she said, and at Charlotte Everly's tea. I'd like to give you the opportunity to say it to me instead. James spread his hands in a gesture of open reasonableness. Eleanor, I only expressed concern. Jonathan's name is attached to this property, to this county, too. Jonathan's name is not attached to this property, Eleanor said. The property was left to me specifically by your grandfather in a codicil filed in 1807. Mr. Hale has a sworn attestation ready. Would you like me to show you the document? The open reasonableness expression flickered. I'm sure there are questions of interpretation. There are not, she said. I've had 2 attorneys read it. Would you like the names? James was quiet for a moment. The smile was still there, but it had become something else. The kind of smile that is held in place by will rather than feeling. Eleanor, I'm trying to protect the family. You're trying to frighten me, she said, and her voice was as pleasant and as steady as a stone wall. You've been doing it since I married your brother. You told Jonathan at our wedding that he'd done all right for himself considering. You told me 2 years later that my opinions on the land bill were charming. You've been telling people in Fredericksburg that I am a woman having some kind of episode and that your brother is managing it patiently. She paused. I want you to understand something, James. I am not having an episode. I am not a situation to be managed, and I am not frightened of you. James Whitmore set his hands on his knees. The smile was gone. You should be careful, he said, and his voice had dropped the warmth entirely. A woman publishing political essays under her own name, running an unauthorized school on a contested property, people talk Eleanor. It affects more than you. It affects Jonathan, you mean, she said. It affects the family. Your family's reputation, Eleanor said, is entirely outside my responsibility. My work is not political, it is legal. The property is not contested, it is documented. And the school is authorized by the property owner, which is me. She walked to the front door and opened it. I think we've said what we needed to say. James stood. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she recognized she had seen it on men who were recalculating. Men who had expected a different kind of resistance and were now adjusting for terrain. Jonathan won't stand behind you indefinitely, he said. When the pressure gets real, James, she said, I have been standing behind myself for 44 years. Jonathan's position is his own business. She met his eyes without moving. Good day. He left. She closed the door. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went back to her desk, turned the printer's letter face up, and read it again from the beginning. Dear Mrs. Eleanor Marsh Whitmore, it read. We are honored to publish your 4th essay in our October edition. We would further like to offer you a standing column to run quarterly titled At Your Discretion. Your clarity of argument and directness of voice are precisely what this paper has needed. She sat with that for a moment. Then she heard the kitchen door open and Mrs. Holt's voice saying, Mr. Whitmore's horse is at the gate again. And Eleanor thought for one disorienting second that James had come back, and then she realized it was a different horse and a different Whitmore entirely. And she felt the complicated thing again, only this time it was more complicated than before because something had shifted in it. Jonathan came in through the kitchen. He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? He said immediately. James was here, she said. Jonathan went very still. What did he say? He said I should be careful. He said people talk. She paused. He said you won't stand behind me indefinitely. The stillness on Jonathan's face became something harder. He came here himself. He sat in my front room and suggested the property was contested and the school was unauthorized. And when I told him I had legal documentation for both, he tried a different angle. She looked at her husband. He's afraid, Jonathan. Not of me exactly. Of what happens when the story can't be rewritten. Jonathan set his hat down on the table. I'm going to Fredericksburg, he said. Jonathan. He's my brother, Jonathan said. What he does reflects on this family, and I have let him. I have let him operate as though his opinions about this marriage were the ones that mattered, and that ends now. His jaw was set in a way she had not seen since the early years of their marriage, when he had been younger and less comfortable, and more willing to fight for things. This is my decision, Eleanor. I'm not asking your permission for this one. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about Abigail's letter. She thought about imperfect methods and men who move because they cannot stand to watch something they value be destroyed. She thought about the difference between a man who had forgotten her birthday 7 years running and a man who was standing in her kitchen with his jaw set and his hat on the table and an expression that said he understood finally and completely what the cost of his inattention had been. All right, she said. He looked up. Go, she said. Say what needs to be said. She paused. But Jonathan, say it because it's right, not just because it's James. He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed across his face that she couldn't name, but felt somehow like the beginning of something that had been a long time coming. Yes, he said. I know the difference. He picked up his hat and walked out the door, and Eleanor stood in her kitchen in her cottage that had always been hers and listened to the sound of his horse moving fast down the road toward Fredericksburg. And then she turned back to her desk, sat down, uncapped her ink, and wrote the next line. She was not waiting for the outcome. She was working toward one. Those were, she had learned, entirely different postures, and she intended from this point forward to hold only the one that belonged to her. Jonathan did not come back from Fredericksburg that night. Eleanor did not wait up. She read by lamplight until 10 o'clock, finished the corrections on her 4th essay, and went to bed in the east bedroom of her cottage with the window open and the summer dark pressing soft and warm against the curtains, and she slept better than she had slept in years. In the morning, a letter arrived before breakfast. It was from Jonathan, written at what appeared to be a Fredericksburg inn, the handwriting slightly uneven in the way of a man who had been awake too long. She stood in the kitchen and read it standing up. Eleanor, I found James at the Everly house last evening. He'd stayed for supper, which tells you something about how certain he was that his visit to you had gone well. I will not write here everything that was said between us, because some of it is between brothers and not fit to put in a letter. But I want you to know the end of it. I told James that if he speaks your name again in any county in this state, in a context that is not respectful, I will ensure that every man of business he depends on in Richmond knows exactly what kind of man he is when he thinks no one of consequence is watching. He knows I mean it. He's known me long enough to know the difference between when I am making a threat and when I am making a promise. I am coming back to Willow Creek tomorrow. There is something I need to say to you that I cannot say in a letter. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it with the others. She told herself she was not thinking about what he needed to say. Then she spent the next 2 hours thinking about it, which was at least honest. Clara arrived at 8 with 14 students and the expression that told Eleanor something had happened before she said a word. Alcott came to see me yesterday evening, Clara said the moment the girls were settled and the lesson had begun. She and Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway, voices low. He came to my lodgings in Ashford, unannounced. What did he say? Eleanor said. He said the board is meeting Friday. He said he intends to bring my proposal forward again, and this time he believes it will pass. Clara paused. He said he'd had a conversation with Jonathan Whitmore that clarified several things for him. Eleanor was quiet. He also said... Clara stopped. Something moved across her face that Eleanor recognized as the expression of a person deciding whether to say the harder thing. He said he'd read your essay, the one on contract law. His wife had a copy. He said he hadn't realized... Clara looked at her directly. He said he hadn't realized the legal situation was as restrictive as you described, for women. He said he read the whole thing twice. Harrison Alcott read the whole thing twice, Eleanor said slowly. Apparently his wife told him she'd been waiting 20 years for someone to write it plainly enough that she could hand it to him and say, "Read this." Clara paused. She told him that over breakfast. He came to see me that evening. Eleanor thought about that. She thought about Ruth Carey's Martha and the dinner table. She thought about what a single clear argument handed to the right person at the right moment could actually do in an ordinary room in an ordinary life. Clara, she said. The column the Richmond paper offered me. I want to use the first one to talk about the school board. Not personally, not James, not Alcott by name. But the situation, the pattern. Clara was still for a moment. That's a bigger step than the essays. Yes, Eleanor said. It is. It will make more enemies. It will also reach more people. Eleanor held her gaze. Your work deserves to be seen. The girls in that room deserve to be seen. I am not interested in writing carefully enough that no one takes offense. I have been doing that for 20 years, and it has accomplished precisely nothing. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Write it." Chuck. Jonathan arrived at noon. He looked tired in the way of a man who had slept a few hours in a strange bed after a hard conversation, and he looked something else too lighter somehow, as though whatever he had gone to Fredericksburg to put down had actually been put down. He sat at the kitchen table. Eleanor put coffee in front of him. She sat across from him and waited. I owe you an apology, he said. Not for James, for longer than James. Jonathan, let me say it, he said. Not sharply, just steadily. I need to say it properly, and I need you to let me finish because I've started it in my head about 15 times in the last 3 weeks and kept stopping at the hard part. He looked at his coffee cup. I knew you were unhappy. Not this year, years ago. I knew it the way you know a thing when you don't want to act on it, so you let it stay at the edge of your attention, and you tell yourself it isn't as serious as it looks. He looked up. That is a coward's way of managing a marriage, and you deserved better than a coward. Eleanor sat very still. I don't know, he said slowly, if I can be the husband you needed 15 years ago. I think it's probably too late for that exact version of things. But I would like, Eleanor. I would like very much to be something useful to the person you are right now, if you'll tell me how. He paused. I'm not asking you to come back to Whitmore Hall. I'm not asking for anything to go back to what it was. I'm asking if there is a version of this of us that works from where we actually are. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Eleanor could hear Clara's voice through the wall, clear and steady. The sound of a lesson in progress. The sound of 14 girls learning things they were not supposed to need to know. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "what did you think this marriage was? When we married, what did you think it was supposed to be?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was an arrangement that suited us both," he said. "I thought you were content. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought because you never said otherwise, there was no otherwise to say. And now I think I confused your silence with agreement for 20 years, he said. And I think that is on me, not on your silence." He looked at her with something that had no calculation in it at all. "I think my grandfather saw you more clearly in the last year of his life than I have in 20 years of marriage. And I think that is the most shaming thing I've ever had to admit to myself." Eleanor looked at her husband. She thought about all the things she had rehearsed for this conversation, the careful positions, the measured responses, the way she had planned to hold her ground. None of those rehearsals had accounted for this. For a man who had arrived at the truth by his own road and was simply sitting with it, not asking her to make it easier for him. "I'm going to keep the cottage," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to keep the school, and the column, and the essays, all of it under my full name." "I know," he said again. "I would expect nothing less. And I'm going to need—" She paused, choosing carefully. "I'm going to need you to understand that my work is not secondary to your schedule. Not now, not ever again." "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "There is a version of us, from where we are." She paused. "But it will look different from what it was." "Different is fine," Jonathan said. "Different is what I'm here for." And Eleanor, who had not cried once through all of it, not the birthday, not the packing, not James Whitmore in her front room, felt something behind her eyes that she quietly, privately refused to let become tears, because she was not finished building the thing she was building, and she intended to do it with clear vision. "All right," she said. "Then let's talk about what different looks like." The board meeting was on Friday, and Eleanor did not attend it. She sent Clara. She stayed at the cottage and taught the morning lesson herself badly enthusiastically, with a passion for the subject and a technical approach to teaching that made Martha Carey say, "Mrs. Whitmore, you explain things like a lawyer." And Eleanor said, "That's because I am one more or less." And Martha grinned like the sun coming out. Clara came back at 2:00. Eleanor heard her on the path and went to the door and read her face before she said a single word. The proposal had passed. 5-1. The one dissenter was a man named Gerald Fitch, who Clara said had objected primarily on the grounds that he didn't see why girls needed formal instruction in legal matters, to which Harrison Alcott had said, with the voice of a man who had recently read something that embarrassed him about his own ignorance, that the question was not what Gerald Fitch thought girls needed, but what the law of the state of Virginia actually provided. And then he had read directly from Eleanor's essay. He read it out loud, Clara said, in the board meeting, to 6 men who had never read it. Eleanor put her hand over her mouth for a moment. "Gerald Fitch looked like he'd swallowed something sideways," Clara added. "It was one of the finer things I've seen." Eleanor laughed. She hadn't meant to. It came out sudden and genuine and slightly undignified, and Clara started laughing too, and for a moment, the two of them stood in the front room of Willow Creek Cottage, laughing like women who have been holding something tightly for a long time and have just briefly set it down. Then Martha Carey's voice came from the back room saying, "Mrs. Whitmore, we finished the reading exercise." And Eleanor straightened up and said, "I'll be right there," and went back to teaching. Dad. The twist arrived on a Tuesday morning 9 weeks into the school in the form of a letter with a Philadelphia return address. Eleanor did not recognize the name on the envelope. She opened it at her desk, half expecting it to be from one of the printer's contacts, some follow-up about the column. It was from a woman named Margaret Hale. No relation to the attorney who wrote that she was the editorial secretary of a new periodical called The American Woman's Register Publishing out of Philadelphia, and that she had obtained a copy of Eleanor's essay on contract law through a mutual acquaintance, and that she had read every piece signed E. Whitmore she could locate thereafter. "We are building a publication." Margaret Hale wrote that intends to do what no American periodical has yet done: consistently treat women as legal and intellectual persons, with standing to discuss their own circumstances. We have contributors from Boston, New York, and Baltimore. We do not yet have a voice from the southern states. We believe your work represents exactly the kind of clear, legally grounded, morally serious writing that our readership requires. We would like to offer you a position as contributing editor and our southern correspondent. Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she set it face down on her desk, which was what she did when she needed to think without the page staring at her, and she sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. Philadelphia. A national publication. Southern correspondent. Her name, her full name on a masthead read by women across 4 states. She picked it back up and read it a 4th time. Then she did something she would not have done 2 months ago. She went to find Jonathan. He had been coming to the cottage on Tuesdays and Thursdays consistently without pressing for more than she offered. He helped Samuel Porter with the well repair on the last Thursday. He sat at the kitchen table on Tuesdays and read while Eleanor wrote, and they ate lunch together, and it was the most companionable they had been possibly ever, because the ease of it was not the ease of 2 people performing a marriage, but the ease of 2 people who had finally negotiated an honest one. She found him in the garden talking to Samuel about the east fence, and she said, "Jonathan, come inside." He took one look at her face and came inside. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his eyes move down the page, and she watched his face, and what she saw there was not complicated, it was pride. Clean, uncomplicated, genuine pride, the kind that is not about the person feeling it at all. He finished reading. He set the letter on the kitchen table. He looked up. "Philadelphia," he said. "Philadelphia," she confirmed. "Contributing editor." Southern correspondent. She held his gaze. "It means travel potentially. It means a larger audience than the Richmond paper. It means," she paused. "It means I become someone who is publicly known for this, not E. Whitmore in initials, Eleanor Marsh Whitmore in full." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What is there to decide? I am telling you because it affects this." She gestured slightly between them. "This arrangement. It affects what I am and what I'm doing, and how much of my time and attention." Eleanor. Jonathan picked up the letter and held it out to her. "My grandfather left you this cottage because he saw who you were. You have been the best legal mind in this county for 12 years without anyone knowing your name. A publication in Philadelphia wants to fix that." He paused. "The only question worth asking is whether you want to." She looked at him. "Do you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then write back today," he said. "What do you need from me?" She almost said nothing, which was the habit of 20 years speaking, before she could stop it. She caught herself. "I need you," she said, "to keep coming on Tuesdays. I think better when there's someone else in the room." Jonathan's face did something complicated and quiet and real. "Done," he said. She wrote to Margaret Hale that afternoon and accepted the position. She wrote to Abigail that evening and told her everything the board meeting the column Philadelphia Jonathan on Tuesdays. Abigail's response arrived 4 days later and was 7 pages long and contained 2 full paragraphs of pure, vindicated triumph, and 1 sentence near the end that said simply, "I have always known you, Eleanor. I am glad the rest of the world is catching up." She pinned that sentence above her desk. She did not show it to Jonathan, but she thought about it every morning when she sat down to write. The column ran in the Richmond paper on the first Friday of October under the full title, "On the Education of Women in Virginia, A Legal and Moral Case," by Eleanor Marsh Whitmore. Clara Bennett bought 6 copies and distributed them to every member of the school board. Ruth Carey bought 1 and kept it on her kitchen shelf. Martha Carey, who had helped Eleanor check the legal citations the week before publication, read her own copy 3 times and then asked if she could borrow one of Eleanor's law books. Eleanor gave her the book to keep. The response to the column was larger than anything the Richmond paper had published in its legal section in 2 years. Letters came from Charlottesville and Richmond and as far north as Alexandria. 3 were from men who disagreed vigorously. 7 were from women who wrote as though they had been waiting for someone to say the thing and were slightly dazed to find it had finally been said. 1 letter came from a woman in Lynchburg named Catherine Morse, who wrote, "I have been trying to explain to my husband for 6 years why I ought to be permitted to sign the deed to our property. I have now sent him your column with the relevant paragraph marked." He read it. He said he would speak with our attorney. "I want you to know that what you wrote did something in 3 pages that I have not been able to do in 6 years. Please, keep writing." Eleanor read that letter 4 times. She kept it in the top drawer with Abigail's letters and Jonathan's letter from the Fredericksburg Inn. She showed it to Clara. Clara read it without speaking. Then she set it carefully on the kitchen table and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not sentiment. Exactly, Clara was not a sentimental woman, but was the look of someone who has been doing something hard for a long time and has just received evidence that the hard thing was worth it. "We need more chairs," Clara said. "How many more?" Eleanor said. "At least 8. A pause. "I had 4 families come to me this week who had read the column and wanted to know if the school had room. 2 of them have sons they want to bring as well." "Boys," Eleanor said. "Boys," Clara confirmed. Apparently, some fathers, upon reading a clear legal argument about the value of educating daughters, concluded that they would also like their sons educated by women who think that clearly. Eleanor considered this. "We'll need to rearrange the front room." "I was thinking about the barn," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her. "Samuel Porter said he could convert the hayloft in 2 weeks," Clara said. "Proper floor, 2 windows, a good stove for winter, space for 30 students." She met Eleanor's eyes. "Eleanor, this isn't a school in a cottage anymore." The weight of that landed slowly the way the important things do not. Like a sudden noise, but like light coming through a window growing by degrees until you realize the room has changed entirely. "No," Eleanor said. "I suppose it isn't." So, Clara sat down at the kitchen table with the expression of a woman who has been waiting to have a particular conversation. "What do we call it?" Eleanor looked at her. She thought about the first morning she had sat in this kitchen and written the line, "The right of a woman to hold property in her own name is not a matter of sentiment, but of law." She thought about Margaret Hale's letter from Philadelphia. She thought about Catherine Morse in Lynchburg, marking the relevant paragraph. She thought about Martha Carey, who now had a law book on her shelf that she was reading of her own free will before supper. "The Willow Creek School," Eleanor said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "For girls. For students," Eleanor said. "We will not make the board's mistake and decide before we begin who deserves to learn." Clara nodded slowly. The look on her face was not the beginning of something new. It was the middle of something that had been growing quietly for months, tended like Samuel Porter's garden, by 2 women who understood that the important things take the time they take and are not improved by rushing. "All right," Clara said. "The Willow Creek School." She stood. "I'll talk to Samuel tomorrow about the barn." She went out through the front door, and Eleanor heard her footsteps on the path, and then the sound of the afternoon, the creek somewhere below the east field. The girls' voices still carrying from the back room, the ordinary sounds of a place that was becoming quietly and irrevocably something that would outlast its beginning. Eleanor turned back to her desk. She had a column due to Philadelphia in 11 days. She had 3 letters to answer and a stack of legal citations to verify and a note from the Richmond printer saying the 4th essay had generated more correspondence than anything they had run in the past year. She sat down. She uncapped her ink. She wrote the first line of the Philadelphia piece. "A woman who knows the law is not a threat to the men around her. She is a mirror. And what some men cannot tolerate is not her knowledge, it is their own reflection." She read it back. She kept it. And outside her window in the warm last days of a Virginia October, her school was filling up. Her name was spreading across the state in black ink on white paper. And somewhere down the road, a man she had married 20 years ago was riding toward her on a Tuesday. Not because she needed him, not because the arrangement required it. but because they had finally, after all this time, figured out how to choose each other honestly. That was not everything, but it was, Eleanor thought, far more than nothing. She kept writing. The letter from James Whitmore arrived on a Wednesday, and it was 3 sentences long. Eleanor read it standing at her desk, still in her morning coat ink, not yet uncapped. She read it once. She set it down. She read it again. Eleanor. I have been asked by our mutual attorney, Mr. Hale, to confirm that I have no further claims or objections regarding the Willow Creek property deed. I confirm this. I also wish to say, and I say it without Jonathan's knowledge or prompting, that I was wrong about you. I have been wrong about you for a long time. 3 sentences. No flourish, no charm, no calculated warmth, just that. She stood with the letter in her hand for a full minute. Then she put it in the top drawer with the others, with Abigail's 7 pages, and Jonathan's Fredericksburg letter, and Catherine Morse from Lynchburg, and the printer's note, and the codicil, and she sat down, uncapped her ink, and went to work. She did not tell Jonathan about the letter when he came on Tuesday. She kept it to herself, not because it was a secret, but because some things were for her alone, and she had learned, was still learning, the difference between privacy and hiding. This was privacy. The letter from James Whitmore belonged to no one but Eleanor, because it was not about a battle won. It was about a long, slow, private accounting, and she did not need an audience for that. She kept writing. The Willow Creek School opened its barn building on the first Monday of November with 31 students, 4 oil lamps, a good iron stove that Samuel Porter had installed himself, and Clara Bennett standing at the front of the room, with the posture of a woman who has been waiting her entire professional life to stand in exactly this room. Eleanor sat in the back the way she always did, and she watched. Martha Carey was in the second row. She had her law book. Eleanor's law book, now hers, open on her knee under the desk, reading ahead, which Eleanor had noticed she did every lesson. Martha's younger sister had enrolled the previous week. 3 boys sat in the back row with the particular studied indifference of young men who do not want to appear eager, but are in fact paying close attention. After the lesson, one of the boys, a 15-year-old named William Dodd, whose father ran the mill on the creek road, stopped at the door and said to Eleanor with great seriousness, "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Bennett said you write about law." "I do," Eleanor said. "My father said lawyers don't need to know about women's property," William said. "He said it isn't practical. He said the law is the law." Eleanor looked at this boy, 15 years old, honest-faced, genuinely asking, not challenging. "Your father is right, that the law is the law," she said. "He is less right about what lawyers need to know. A lawyer who does not understand every part of the law he operates within is like a mill worker who only understands half the wheel." She paused. "Does your father understand the whole wheel?" William thought about that. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "He says a man who doesn't know his equipment is a danger to himself and everyone around him." "Then you tell your father," Eleanor said, "that a lawyer who doesn't know the legal standing of half the population is a danger to every client who walks through his door." She held his gaze. "Come back Thursday, Mr. Dodd. We're discussing contract formation." William Dodd came back Thursday. He brought 2 questions written on a folded piece of paper and asked them both. Eleanor answered them both in full. Page. The Philadelphia piece ran in December. Margaret Hale sent her 6 copies and a letter saying the response had been the largest single-piece correspondence the American Woman's Register had received since its founding. She said they were printing an additional run. She said 3 women had written asking who Eleanor Marsh Whitmore was, and whether she was available for correspondence. Available for correspondence, Abigail said, reading over Eleanor's shoulder when she arrived for Christmas week. "Eleanor, you are becoming famous." "I am becoming red," Eleanor said. "Those are different things." "Are they?" "Famous means people recognize your face. Read means people recognize your argument." Eleanor turned back to her desk. "I would rather be red." Abigail sat on the edge of the writing desk. She had always sat on the edges of things, perched and ready, constitutionally unable to settle entirely. "Tell me about Jonathan," she said. Eleanor kept her eyes on the page. "What about him?" "He rode out here on Christmas Eve." Abigail said. I saw his horse at the gate when I arrived. He'd been here 3 hours. He helped Samuel hang the new shutters on the barn, Eleanor said. He hung shutters, Abigail said in the tone of someone filing information carefully. And we had supper, Eleanor said. The 3 of us. You missed it by 20 minutes. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Are you happy, Eleanor? Eleanor set down her pen. She turned and looked at her sister, at the woman who had sent her Wollstonecraft first, and enclosed her essay in a letter to Clara Bennett, and written 7 furious, loving, vindicating pages when it all started moving. I am building something, she said. Every day I sit down and I build something that didn't exist the day before. The school, the column, the Philadelphia work. All of it is mine. All of it is real. She paused. Yes, Abigail. I am happy. Abigail nodded slowly. And Jonathan? Eleanor picked her pen back up. Jonathan is learning to be someone I didn't know he could be, she said. I am choosing carefully and with full information to give that the time it needs. That's not the same as happy, Abigail said. No, Eleanor said. It's better than happy. It's honest. But January brought the hardest frost Virginia had seen in 6 years, and it brought something else as well, a formal invitation delivered by post from a woman named Frances Wright, a name Eleanor recognized immediately with a jolt that went straight through her chest, asking if Eleanor Marsh Whitmore would be willing to speak at a gathering in Richmond in the spring on the subject of women's legal education. Frances Wright, who lectured publicly, who had spoken before mixed audiences, men and women together, on subjects that made half of Congress uncomfortable, who was at this precise moment in history the most publicly consequential woman in American intellectual life. Eleanor set the letter on her desk. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked it up, walked to the front room, and showed it to Clara, who was preparing the afternoon lesson. Clara read it. She set it down. She looked at Eleanor. You're going to say yes, Clara said. I'm thinking, Eleanor said. You're going to say yes, Clara said again, with the certainty of a woman who had been paying close attention for 4 months. You're only thinking because saying yes will mean standing in front of a room full of people and being Eleanor Marsh Whitmore publicly, completely without any of it being initials or essays on paper, and that is the part that frightens you. Eleanor looked at her. Does it show? Only because I know you, Clara said. No one else would see it. She picked the invitation back up and handed it back. Eleanor, you have changed what happens in this county for girls who will never know your name. You are about to change what happens in this state. The next step is letting people see you while you do it. Eleanor took the letter. And if the reception is hostile, then you will handle it the way you've handled everything else, Clara said. With perfect composure and a legal argument they can't find the hole in. A pause. And I will be in the 3rd row, making sure your citations are correct. Eleanor almost smiled. You'd come to Richmond? I'll come to Richmond, Clara said. Someone has to watch Gerald Fitch's face when you open your mouth. She wrote back to Frances Wright that evening. She accepted. She told Jonathan on Tuesday. He was quiet for a moment when she said the name Frances Wright. A complicated quiet, the kind that told her he was doing the same arithmetic most men of his class and time did when they heard that name. The social weight of it, the implications, the visibility. She watched him work through it. He came out the other side and said, "What do you need for the preparation?" She stared at him. "You'll need time to write the speech," he said practically. "Is the school manageable without you for the weeks you're working on it? Clara can run the lessons. Can she run the administration as well? Or do you need to make arrangements?" Jonathan. "And travel to Richmond," he said. "Will you stay with family or at an inn? I can write to the Wentworths if you'd prefer to stay somewhere you're known." Jonathan. She stopped him. He looked up. "I expected you to be concerned." He was quiet for a moment. "I am concerned," he said. "Frances Wright is Eleanor. Half the men in Virginia consider her a menace to the social order." "I know," she said. "And you're going to stand beside her in Richmond and speak publicly." "Yes," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I was going to ask," he said, "if you'd like me to come with you." The silence that followed was the kind that means more than whatever word comes next. "Not to manage it," he said quickly. "Not to, I'm not there to make it look respectable, or to give anyone the impression that I've endorsed. I have endorsed it. I am endorsing it. That is not what I—" He stopped himself, took a breath. "I would like to come, because you are my wife, and you are about to do something significant, and I have missed every significant thing you've done for 20 years, and I would prefer not to miss this one." Eleanor looked at Jonathan Whitmore, at this man who had forgotten her birthday 7 times, and hung shutters on her barn in December, and told his brother to get out of his house and learn to sit quietly in a room while she worked, and was now asking with genuine humility if he could stand in a Richmond hall and watch her become fully, publicly, irreversibly herself. "Yes," she said, "you can come." He nodded. He looked down at his coffee cup. He looked back up. "Will you tell me what the speech is about?" "When you're ready." "When I'm ready," she said. "Yes." The twist that came in February was not what Eleanor had expected, and she had by this point learned to expect the unexpected in forms that arrived quietly before they hit. It came in the form of a second letter from Margaret Hale in Philadelphia. Not a letter about the column or the next piece, but a personal letter, 2 pages, that Margaret Hale had clearly written and rewritten before sending. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore." It began, "I am writing to you outside my editorial capacity, because what I have to say is not a professional matter, but a personal one. I have received a letter from a woman in Charlottesville, I will not share her name without her permission, who tells me she is a former student of yours. She is 18 years old. She says she attended your school last autumn, and that she has since decided she wants to study law formally. She wants to know if such a thing is possible. I told her I did not know of a path for a woman in Virginia to study law formally at this time. I told her I would ask you because you would know better than I. But that is not why I am writing. I am writing because she also said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said Mrs. Whitmore taught us that knowing the law was only half of it. The other half was deciding what to do with what you knew, and she said, I have decided. I thought you should know that. I thought you should know what you are leaving behind in these girls." Eleanor put the letter down. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about Ruth Carey saying, "I reckon that's true for more than just the girls." She thought about Martha's law book. She thought about William Dodd and his folded piece of paper with 2 questions. She thought about the first morning she had sat in this kitchen and written that first line and felt something unknot in her chest. She picked up her pen. She did not write to Margaret Hale first. She wrote to the girl in Charlottesville, whose name Margaret Hale provided in a postscript with the girl's permission. She wrote to her directly by name, and she said, "The path does not yet exist in the form you are imagining. That is not the same as saying it cannot be built. Come to Willow Creek in the spring. Bring your questions. We will figure out together what the next step looks like." She sent the letter the same afternoon. Then she wrote the Richmond speech. The morning before they left for Richmond, Eleanor rose at 5 the way she always did. She went to her study. She sat at her desk. She did not write. She simply sat with her hands flat on the surface of the desk, and she looked at the room around her, at the books on the shelves. All the right ones now in the order she wanted them, the ones she had chosen, rather than inherited. At the printer's copies of her essays framed in plain wood above the bookcase, because Mrs. Holt had done it without asking, and Eleanor had decided not to argue. At Abigail's sentence pinned to the wall. At the stack of student work from the current term waiting to be reviewed. At the morning light. She thought about a woman sitting at a candlelit table with a birthday cake and 11 candles and a glass raised to an empty chair. She thought about how that woman had felt not broken, which was the surprising part even then. Not broken. Just finished with a particular way of being. Finished and uncertain what came next, and doing the only thing she knew to do when uncertain, which was to sit straight and raise the glass and wait for herself to arrive at the answer. She had arrived. Jonathan knocked at the study door at 7. She called him in. He stood in the doorway and looked at her desk in the morning light, and he said, "Ready." "Nearly," she said. She picked up the speech, 16 pages, the clearest 16 pages she had ever written, and she tucked it into her traveling case. One more thing. She opened the top drawer. She took out every letter she had kept since August Abigail's 7 pages. Jonathan's Fredericksburg letter, the printer's note. Catherine Morse from Lynchburg, the codicil. James's 3 sentences. Margaret Hale's Philadelphia letter. The girl from Charlottesville's address. She did not read them again. She simply held the stack of them for a moment, feeling the weight. Then, she put them back in the drawer, closed it, and stood up. "Now I'm ready," she said. Chapter 5. The hall in Richmond held 200 people. Eleanor stood backstage and felt the noise of them through the wall. The particular charged noise of 200 people who have come to hear something they are not entirely sure they are ready to hear, which is always the best kind of audience. Clara was in the 3rd row. She had traveled with them from the cottage, and she had spent the carriage ride reviewing Eleanor's citations with the focused ferocity of a woman who takes her self-appointed responsibilities seriously. Jonathan had sat across from both of them and listened to the entire citation review without once looking bored, which Eleanor noted and stored quietly. Frances Wright found Eleanor backstage 20 minutes before the program and shook her hand, the way men shook hands, firmly, briefly, with no performance in it. She was tall, direct, with the particular energy of someone who has been doing something dangerous for long enough that the danger no longer registers as fear. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I've read all of it." "Miss Wright," Eleanor said. "So have I." Frances Wright smiled. "They'll push back," she said. "There will be men in that room who came specifically to push back. Some of them will do it before you've finished speaking." "I know," Eleanor said. "Are you all right with that?" Eleanor looked at her steadily. "Miss Wright," she said, "I spent 20 years not saying things because I was concerned about the pushback. I have 4 months of evidence that the alternative is considerably more productive." She straightened the front of her dress, the blue one, always the blue one now. "Let them push." Frances Wright looked at her for a moment with an expression that was sharp and warm at the same time. "Good," she said. "You're on in 10 minutes. Eleanor walked out onto that stage in front of 200 people in Richmond, Virginia, in the winter of 1818, and she did not hesitate at the edge of it. She walked to the center. She looked at the room, and she found Clara Bennett in the 3rd row, who gave her one small decisive nod, and Jonathan Whitmore in the 6th, who was sitting perfectly still with his hands on his knees, and his whole face open in the way of a man who is seeing something he wishes he had seen 20 years earlier, and is choosing to see it fully now rather than look away. She began to speak. She spoke for 35 minutes. She spoke about property law and contract rights and the legal standing of married women in Virginia. She spoke about 31 students in a barn on a creek road, and a printer in Richmond, and a girl in Charlottesville who had decided. She spoke without notes for the last 10 minutes because she knew the words. She had always known the words. She had simply spent too long finding places to keep them that cost her the least. 3 men interrupted. She answered each of them without pausing the thread of her argument. One of them sat back down, looking as though he'd been handed something he hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. One of them interrupted twice, and the second time he did, a woman 2 rows behind him said loudly, "Let her finish." And the room laughed, the good kind of laugh, the kind that comes from relief and recognition all at once. She finished. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Clara Bennett started clapping, and the 200 people in that hall followed her. Afterward, standing in the vestibule while people came to speak to her, Eleanor felt Jonathan's hand at her elbow, not guiding, not steering, just present. She turned to look at him. His eyes were bright. He looked like a man who has been profoundly and deservedly humbled by something and is grateful for the humbling. "Eleanor," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Don't," she said gently. "Not here. Later." He nodded. He stepped back and let the people come. They came for 40 minutes. Women who wanted to shake her hand and tell her what her essays had done in their houses, their marriages, their conversations with attorneys and husbands and fathers. Men who wanted to argue further, 2 of them civil. This time, the kind of argument that is actually inquiry in a hostile coat. A young woman of about 20 who introduced herself as a printer's daughter from Alexandria and said she wanted to know how to submit a piece to the American Woman's Register. Eleanor spent 5 minutes with the printer's daughter. She gave her Margaret Hale's address. She told her to write clearly and without apology and to sign her full name. "Even if they don't like it," the young woman said. "Especially then," Eleanor said. They rode home to Willow Creek in the dark. Clara was in the carriage, half asleep against the window, exhausted with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running on purpose and determination for 16 hours and has finally allowed the adrenaline to drain. Jonathan sat across from Eleanor. The carriage moved through the winter dark, and the only sound was the road and the horses and Clara's quiet breathing. "Tell me something," Jonathan said quietly so as not to wake Clara. "What? When did you know," he said, "that you were going to be this, all of this, the school, the essays, the column tonight?" He looked at her steadily. "When did you know it was possible?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "The morning after my birthday," she said. "The 7th one." She paused. "I sat at the kitchen table at Whitmore Hall, and I wrote a sentence, and it came out the way my thoughts actually move. Not the way I'd learned to move them for other people. Mine." She looked at her husband. "I think it had always been possible. I just needed to stop spending my energy making space for everyone else's comfort." Jonathan was quiet for a long time. The carriage moved through the dark. "I'm sorry," he said, "that I was one of the people you were making space for." "I know," she said. "I mean it, Eleanor." "Jonathan." She held his gaze across the dark carriage. "I know you mean it. That is the whole difference between now and before." She paused. "Go to sleep. It's a long ride." He did not sleep, but he was quiet, and she thought that was probably close enough. Geesh. They arrived at Willow Creek near midnight. Clara went directly to the guest room. Jonathan helped Samuel Porter with the horses, and then came back to find Eleanor standing in her study with her traveling case open and the Philadelphia letter from Margaret Hale in her hand. "The girl from Charlottesville is coming in the spring," Eleanor said, "the one who wants to study law." Jonathan leaned in the doorway. "What will you do for her?" "I'll teach her everything I know," Eleanor said. "And then I'll help her figure out what comes after that." She set the letter down. "There's no path yet. We'll build one." He looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes. "The school. Clara. Margaret Hale. The women who wrote to me from Lynchburg and Alexandria, and God knows where else by spring." She paused. "You, if you want to be useful." "I want to be useful," he said immediately. "Then come on Thursday instead of Tuesday," she said. "We're starting a legal reading group for the older students. You know Harrison Alcott and half the county bar. I need someone who can tell me which of them is worth inviting to speak and which of them will waste our time." Jonathan straightened. "You're inviting practicing attorneys." "I'm inviting the useful ones," she said. "Well, Alcott will come," he said, and something in his voice had shifted into the practical certain register of a man who has found unexpectedly and late the thing he is actually good for. "Edmund Graves won't. Patrick Hale might if you ask him directly rather than through his firm." He paused. "I'll make a list." "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed. He went to get his horse. Eleanor listened to him go, the familiar rhythm of him moving through her cottage, through the home that was hers, that had always been hers, and she did not feel the old, complicated thing. What she felt was simpler and more solid than complicated, the feeling of a woman who has built something real and is standing in it and knows exactly how every stone was placed. She sat down at her desk. She uncapped her ink. She wrote the first line of the next piece, the one for the spring issue of the American Woman's Register, the one she had been turning over in her mind since Richmond. A woman does not discover herself all at once. She recovers herself piece by piece from the years she spent making herself smaller so that the people around her could feel larger. The recovery is the work, and the work I have found does not end. It only gets better. She read it back. She kept it. Outside the window, the Virginia winter was doing what Virginia winters do, pulling back from the cold, slow degrees at a time not yet spring, but no longer the hard dark of December. Something in between. Something becoming. Eleanor Whitmore had turned 44 years old alone at a candlelit table with 12 candles and a 3-layer cake. And she had raised her glass to an empty chair, and she had understood in that clear and private moment that the life she had been given and the life she intended to live were two different things, and that the distance between them was entirely hers to cross. She had crossed it, every careful, deliberate, ink-stained step of it, and she was not finished. She was nowhere near finished. She had a school full of students and a column in Philadelphia, and a girl from Charlottesville coming in the spring with questions Eleanor intended to answer, and a husband learning to be someone worth keeping, and a sister who had always known her, and a friend in Clara Bennett, who had stood in the third row and started the applause before anyone else dared. She had her name on her work in the world, and the world beginning slowly, imperfectly, with considerable resistance to make room. She wrote until 2 in the morning. She went to bed with ink on her fingers and the particular bone-deep satisfaction of a woman who has spent the day doing exactly what she was put on this earth to do. Some women wait their whole lives to be chosen. Eleanor Whitmore had finally done something better. She had chosen herself, and everything else had followed.